Lewis Hamilton leaves Ferrari to sign with McLaren, returning to the team that was once his home. Do you want to know the reasons behind his departure? Curious about the huge salary McLaren will pay for his comeback? If this interests you, stay until the end. I'll explain everything. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. The aftershocks didn't just shake the paddock. They tore through it with the violence of a fault line snapping beneath everyone's feet, a rupture that no engineer, strategist, or media pundit had predicted. One moment, Lewis Hamilton was wearing Ferrari red, still publicly committed to the dream of delivering Maranello its first driver's title in years. The next, he was gone, not at the end of the season, not after a drawn-out negotiation, but instantly, decisively, almost surgically. The announcement landed like a thunderclap. Hamilton, the seven-time world champion, had walked out of Ferrari mid-season and signed a deal with McLaren that was effective immediately. By the next race weekend, he would be back in the papaya orange overalls he'd worn as a rookie, back in the garage where his Formula One journey had begun, now alongside Lando Norris in what was instantly hailed as one of the most audacious mid-season moves in the sport's modern history. The numbers behind the switch were staggering: a $35 million net deal, structured for maximum speed and secrecy, negotiated in a whirlwind of late-night calls, encrypted messages, and private flights between circuits. But the money, as monumental as it was, told only a fraction of the story. This wasn't just a transaction, it was a rescue mission, a reunion steeped in memory and a fierce, almost desperate ambition. It was Hamilton seizing back control of his destiny before the political machinery of Ferrari could strip away the last of his authority. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. For those paying close attention, the warning signs had been flashing for months. The so-called honeymoon period in Maranello had expired before the summer break. In the cold language of lap times and points, Charles Leclerc was beating him consistently, but the real damage was psychological. Weekend after weekend, the balance of power inside Ferrari shifted further toward the Monegasque. The mood in the garage became quieter around Hamilton's side, the engineers more reserved, the updates slower to arrive. And while the public message was one of unity, in the shadows there were glances, half-heard remarks, and the kind of tension that can turn even the most experienced driver into an outsider in his own team. Hungary was the day the tension boiled over. The race itself was brutal. Leclerc drove with precision and speed, pulling away effortlessly, while Hamilton fought the car, struggling with tire degradation and a setup he'd argued against all weekend. Crossing the line felt less like finishing a race and more like crossing a threshold. Inside the Ferrari hospitality suite, as the noise of the post-race celebrations from other teams filtered faintly through the walls, Frédéric Vasseur intercepted him in one of the narrow back corridors, the light overhead casting long shadows. The words that followed were as deliberate as they were cutting. A driver of your status should not be this far behind. It wasn't phrased as feedback or encouragement. It was a ruling, cold and final, an indictment of his position within the team. In that instant, it was as if the invisible contract of trust between Hamilton and Ferrari had been torn in two. He carried those words with him as he walked straight into the press room minutes later, facing an onslaught of questions sharpened like knives. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. The reporters didn't waste time with polite formalities. "Have you lost your edge?" one asked, voice low but loaded. Another went further. "Is Charles now the team's number one?" A third didn't even bother disguising the sting. "Do you think Ferrari made a mistake signing you?" The flashbulbs popped with every micro-expression, catching every subtle shift in his jawline, every slow, deliberate breath he took to keep his answers measured. To the watching world, it was an uncomfortable press conference. To those inside Ferrari, it was confirmation of what they had been whispering for weeks. The pressure was no longer just weighing on Hamilton, it was beginning to crush him. What the cameras didn't capture was the moment, hours later, when Hamilton sat in the quiet of his driver's room, long after most of the team had left, scrolling through his phone as a series of coded messages arrived. These weren't from friends or family. They were from McLaren's inner circle, not obvious enough to be incriminating, but unmistakable to someone reading between the lines. A dinner invitation in Woking disguised as catching up. A message from Zach Brown with nothing but the papaya-colored circle emoji. Then came the call, not long, but enough to make clear that McLaren was ready to make space for him immediately, not in a hypothetical future. Hamilton didn't say yes right away, but in his mind, the decision had already begun to crystallize. McLaren's pitch wasn't just about money or nostalgia. They spoke about the car's potential, about the synergy they believed he could have with Norris, about the hunger inside the team to challenge Red Bull and Ferrari in the same breath. They reminded him of his roots, of the kid who debuted with them in 2007 and came within a point of winning the championship in his first season. And most importantly, they told him something Ferrari hadn't said in months, that they believed in him without conditions. By the time the lawyers began drafting the paperwork, the move had shifted from possibility to inevitability. The agreement was signed under the radar, kept from leaking until the last possible moment, and when it finally broke, it hit the sport like a tidal wave. Inside Ferrari, there was shock, anger, and a scramble to rewrite the narrative. Inside McLaren, there was quiet satisfaction and the knowledge that, for the first time in over a decade, their prodigal son was back. Hamilton's walk into the McLaren garage that first morning wasn't just a return, it was a statement. The eyes of the paddock followed his every move, searching for cracks, for uncertainty, for hesitation. They found none. The man who stepped into the papaya orange was sharper, more dangerous, and more determined than he had looked in months. Ferrari had tried to define his ending. McLaren had just given him a new beginning. In the days that followed, the atmosphere around Hamilton thickened like storm clouds gathering over a coastline, each hour adding more weight to the air he breathed. It wasn't an open declaration, not a blunt conversation in an office or a memo stamped with a Ferrari logo. It was the kind of shift that happened quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, until the pattern was undeniable. Team briefings that once revolved around his feedback began to orbit around Leclerc's inputs, every discussion shaped to extract maximum value from a younger driver's aggressive style. Simulator sessions, which had always been meticulously arranged to accommodate Hamilton's schedule, were suddenly locked in without his consent. A subtle but deliberate reallocation of trust took place. A race engineer who had been by his side for years was moved to a strategic optimization role on the other side of the garage. People he had shared victories and late-night data reviews with were now standing next to Leclerc's car, wearing the same uniforms but carrying different loyalties. It was the whispers that cut the deepest. Someone in the design department, speaking quietly enough to avoid being overheard by the wrong ears, let slip that the wind tunnel team was already working on concepts for the next year's chassis, and that every aero map, every suspension model, every setup scenario was being built to fit Leclerc's driving DNA. The implication didn't need to be spelled out. He could feel it in the air. You're no longer the axis around which this team spins. You are an asset, but not the central one. In the paddock, body language said as much as words. Team principals stopped lingering in his debriefs. Sponsors started requesting more appearances with Leclerc, and the smiling politeness of certain senior staff had taken on the hollow ring of a rehearsed performance. For Hamilton, it wasn't just professional, it was personal. He had built his career on taking control of his path, not waiting for others to dictate when it was over. And as each subtle exclusion stacked up, the decision crystallized. He wouldn't endure this slow fade to irrelevance until the season's end. If the writing was already on the wall, he would choose the pen that signed the next chapter. What Ferrari didn't realize, at least not yet, was that far beyond Maranello, someone had been watching with a hunter's patience. Zak Brown, McLaren CEO, had always kept one eye on the man who once brought his team glory. He knew every nuance of Hamilton's skill set, every intangible that didn't show up in lap-time spreadsheets but could turn a season on its head. Brown was no stranger to the politics of F1, and he recognized the scent of a driver being slowly squeezed out of the position he deserved. When a trusted intermediary hinted that Hamilton might be open to something radical, something immediate, Brown didn't hesitate. The meeting was arranged with the precision of a covert operation. No public hotel lobbies, no known haunts of the Monaco elite. Instead, a discreet private dining room tucked inside an unassuming building overlooking the harbor. The kind of place where the staff knew not to speak of their guests, and where the only sounds were the quiet clink of glassware and the low murmur of yacht engines beyond the terrace. Hamilton arrived with the understated calm of a man who'd been here before, high-stakes conversations behind closed doors, each word carrying the weight of his future. Zak didn't waste time. Leaning forward, elbows resting on the linen-covered table, his voice was firm but low enough to keep the conversation between them. "Lewis," he began, eyes locked in the kind of unflinching gaze that signals both respect and urgency, "I know what's going on in there. I know you're not being treated like the driver you are." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air before continuing. "I'm not here to talk about next season. I'm talking about now, this season. I want you back in our car, in papaya orange, where you belong. I want you leading our charge, and I'm not asking you to take a pay cut. I'm putting $35 million on the table net, because I know you're still the man who can bring us titles. I've seen you do the impossible before, and I know you've got it in you to do it again." Hamilton didn't answer immediately. He leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing just a fraction, weighing the offer not just in terms of money or machinery, but in what it represented, a chance to step out of the shadow being cast over him in Maranello and back into the role of a team spearhead. Through the glass doors, the faint lights from the yachts danced on the water, but inside the room, the stillness was electric. Two men, both aware that what was being discussed could rewrite the grid before the season was halfway done. When Zak Brown sat across from Lewis Hamilton in that quiet, sealed-off room, the air was thick with unspoken history and the kind of tension that comes when both sides know something monumental might be about to happen. At first, Hamilton said little. His arms were folded, his expression measured, his posture defensive but not closed. Brown had been in enough high-stakes negotiations to read body language, and even before a word was spoken, he caught it, that tiny flicker in Hamilton's eyes, the almost imperceptible glint that suggested curiosity, a dangerous curiosity that could easily turn into commitment if the right chords were struck. They began with the easy topics, almost like boxers feeling out the first round, a few remarks about the calendar, the current shape of the grid, the shifting dynamics between teams. But as the minutes passed, the conversation deepened. Brown, choosing his words with surgical precision, moved them toward the serious questions: the financial package, the team's long-term vision, the commitment to giving Hamilton full influence in development decisions. They spoke of McLaren's aerodynamic progress, the wind tunnel data that hinted at untapped potential, the radical upgrades in the pipeline that had already been tested in simulations but never yet unleashed on track. They moved from numbers to philosophy, the way McLaren's engineering culture had shifted, the new synergy between drivers and technical staff, the absence of the suffocating politics that had plagued Hamilton's final months at Ferrari. Over 2 hours passed in what felt like half that time. Every point Brown made was answered with a question, every question with a follow-up, until it stopped feeling like a pitch and more like the mapping of a shared future. The strategy discussions became layered with personal reflections, with Hamilton admitting the toll that the Ferrari chapter had taken on him mentally, and how he longed for an atmosphere where racing felt like racing again. By the end, Hamilton hadn't given the definitive yes, but Brown didn't need it. The tone had shifted, the guardedness had loosened, and there was something in Hamilton's half-smile as he left that told Brown the decision was already made in his head. 48 hours later, it was more than just an idea. It was reality. Ferrari, blindsided, received the formal notification that Hamilton had triggered the rarely invoked exit clause in his contract, citing extraordinary competitive and environmental circumstances. A phrase that, to the outside world, would remain frustratingly vague but inside the paddock would be understood as a blend of technical frustration, political friction, and a sense of being fundamentally out of sync with the project. The red walls of Maranello had kept many secrets, but this one exploded outwards. Within hours, McLaren's communications team had the press release written, polished and cued, their timing so sharp it was obvious they'd been preparing it for weeks, maybe months. It was as though the announcement had been sitting in a drawer, waiting for the ink on Hamilton's release to dry. When Hamilton stepped through the glass doors of the Mclaren Technology Center for the first time in over a decade, the air inside seemed to vibrate. Engineers abandoned their desks, lining the corridors like spectators at a homecoming parade. Mechanics who had been in the garage during his rookie season grinned like schoolkids seeing a childhood hero return. The hum of machinery seemed to fade as every eye followed him. He moved through the building with a mix of nostalgia and purpose, shaking hands, exchanging quiet words with staff who remembered the old days, and meeting new faces who had only read about his first McLaren chapter in books and online archives. And then, at the heart of the facility, Lando Norris waited. He was smiling, that easy, youthful grin, but behind it there was a flicker of awareness, the recognition that this moment was seismic, that sharing a garage with Hamilton would change not just the dynamic of the team but his own career. Their handshake was firm, their eyes locking in a mutual acknowledgement of the road ahead. But almost immediately, the formality gave way to something warmer, almost conspiratorial, two racers speaking the same language without needing to finish sentences. Those close enough to overhear caught fragments. Talk of upcoming circuits, tire wear predictions for Singapore, comments about the handling quirks of the current car, even a quick laugh about the time they'd clashed in a post-race interview. It wasn't just a welcome. It was the first spark of a partnership that could redefine the season. What nobody in that building doubted, as Hamilton and Norris stood side by side in the heart of McLaren's headquarters, was that this wasn't just the signing of a driver. It was the return of a force, one who had left a decade earlier as a world champion and was now coming back, battle-scarred, sharpened, and ready to ignite the team in ways that couldn't be measured in lap times alone. And in the subtle knowing glances exchanged between him and Brown that day, it was clear, the next chapter was already writing itself, and it was going to be nothing short of explosive. "So we're teammates now," Lando said, leaning casually against the doorway, his grin carrying that familiar mix of cheek and curiosity. "Yeah," Hamilton replied, the corner of his mouth curling into a smirk. "Guess I'll have to get used to being the second fastest Brit in orange." Lando raised an eyebrow, firing back without missing a beat. "Careful. I've seen your starts. I might be the one chasing you." The room filled with the kind of laughter that only comes when both parties know there's a thread of truth under the jokes. On the surface, it was light-hearted banter, two drivers testing each other's humor before they tested each other's pace. But beneath that easy exchange was an unspoken acknowledgement of what this partnership meant. Lando was fully aware that having Hamilton beside him wasn't just a change in team dynamics. It was the arrival of one of the sport's greatest ever, a man who had redefined what it meant to win under pressure. Hamilton, for his part, understood that McLaren in 2025 wasn't the McLaren he'd left behind. It had evolved, matured, and was now a team bristling with potential, hungry for silverware after years of frustration. Only minutes later, the tone shifted. Zak Brown summoned them both into his office, closing the door with the deliberate weight of someone who knew the conversation would be etched into the team's history. The walls seemed to hum with anticipation, the kind that comes before big moments. Zak's gaze moved between the two drivers before settling on Hamilton. "Lewis," he began, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of urgency, "I'm not here to talk about your past trophies or the headlines. I brought you here because I still believe you have that thing that made you unstoppable. I remember 2008, the precision, the aggression, the way you refused to lose even when it looked impossible. I think that fire is still in you. And I want it here now, wearing papaya. I'm not aiming for occasional podiums. I'm aiming for wins, for championships, for rewriting where McLaren stands in this sport. This is our moment. This is our shot to change everything." Hamilton leaned back slightly, fingers drumming against the armrest as if pacing his thoughts. He didn't rush his answer. His eyes flicked to Lando, who was sitting forward, elbows on his knees, clearly hooked on the exchange. Then Hamilton's gaze returned to Zak, steady and sharp. "Then let's make it count," he said finally, but the weight in his voice turned the words into something more than agreement. It was a promise. What followed wasn't small talk. Zak laid out the raw truth. The car had speed but not enough consistency. The team had momentum but needed a leader who could turn belief into results under pressure. He spoke of strategy tweaks, of how having two top-tier drivers meant they could pressure Red Bull and Ferrari in ways those teams wouldn't expect. And he didn't shy away from the reality that Hamilton's presence would bring scrutiny. Every race, every lap, every radio call would be under the microscope. Lando listened closely, aware that his own career would inevitably be measured against the benchmark of a seven-time world champion. He wasn't intimidated though. If anything, the challenge seemed to fuel him. In the back of his mind, he imagined the first qualifying session they'd share, the tension on the outlap, the sector times lighting up the board, and the headlines that would follow no matter who came out ahead. For Hamilton, the meeting triggered something deeper. He could feel the familiar spark in his chest, the same one he'd felt before his debut all those years ago, but now tempered with a decade and a half of battle scars, victories, controversies, and relentless pressure. McLaren was giving him a chance not to repeat history, but to forge something entirely new, a second chapter that could be even more dangerous than the first. As they left the office, the two drivers exchanged another glance. It wasn't the easy banter from before, it was sharper, more competitive. There was mutual respect, yes, but also the unspoken understanding that from the moment they hit the track, friendship would take a backseat to speed. The paddock hadn't yet seen them together in the same colors, but whispers had already started. Rival teams were adjusting their threat models. Sponsors were preparing for a wave of media attention. And somewhere in the McLaren garage, a pair of freshly painted cars waited, one for the present face of the team, and one for the legend who had returned not to fade out, but to take aim at the very top again. The shift was almost surreal in its speed, the kind of transition that left even seasoned insiders stunned. One moment, the headlines were still dissecting the fallout from his split with Ferrari, and the next, Lewis Hamilton was already deep inside McLaren's simulator room, the door closed to the outside world, the hum of technology and the sharp scent of fresh carbon fiber filling the air. He sat there, visor off, jaw set, eyes flicking across multiple data screens as engineers crowded around him, feeding him streams of telemetry and historical lap data. Every movement was deliberate, adjusting the steering wheel grips, shifting his seating position millimeter by millimeter until it felt like an extension of his own body, running through simulated corners as if they were muscle memory. His questions came rapid-fire, not out of uncertainty, but from an almost obsessive need to understand every heartbeat of the MCL-39. He wanted to know how the aero balance shifted between high-speed sweepers and tight hairpins, how the chassis behaved under the strain of heavy braking with a full fuel load, how the tire degradation curve changed over a long stint in fluctuating track temperatures. He cross-referenced his own instincts with McLaren's internal models, probing for details others might overlook. The room could feel it. This wasn't a driver just showing up. This was a man integrating himself into the machine at a microscopic level. Mechanics exchanged glances, quietly impressed at how his feedback already aligned with what their best simulations predicted. It was as though the months in red had been erased, replaced by a seamless re-entry into an environment that recognized his rhythm instantly. The ripple effect in the paddock was instant and intoxicating. By the next morning, the McLaren garage had transformed into the focal point of the entire championship circus. Broadcasters set up cameras at every possible angle, reporters jostled for position, and fans in a sea of papaya orange leaned over barriers with phones out, desperate to capture even the smallest glimpse of Hamilton in his new environment. Social media feeds exploded with every frame, him laughing with Lando Norris, him gesturing at a chassis component mid-discussion, him walking with that familiar mix of calm confidence and barely contained competitive fire. Ferrari's response was as diplomatic as it was transparent. Official statements dripped with phrases like mutual respect and shared history, but the undertone was obvious. They'd been outmaneuvered. The paddock could read between the lines. This wasn't just a driver transfer, it was a coup. McLaren had moved fast, spotted the fracture forming in Ferrari's structure, and slipped in with the precision of a team that knew opportunity doesn't knock twice. The move wasn't born from sentimentality. It was a calculated strike, a way to fuse the raw tactical intelligence of a veteran with the fearless aggression of a rising star. For Hamilton, the significance ran deeper than logos and colors. Leaving Ferrari wasn't about walking away from the prancing horse. It was about breaking free from the quiet suffocation of being caught in someone else's political chess game. In his mind, McLaren offered not just a seat, but an open road. No undercurrents of hidden agendas, no subtle pressures to prioritize optics over results. Here he could breathe again, attack corners without wondering whose toes he was stepping on, and fight for podiums without the weight of an empire's expectations pressing down on his shoulders. McLaren's vision was equally unromantic. Yes, there was the poetry of reuniting with the driver who had launched his Formula One story, but beneath that, the decision was ruthlessly pragmatic. They saw in Hamilton a driver who could be both a spearhead and a shield, someone who could take the fight to Red Bull and Mercedes on pure skill, while mentoring Norris in the subtleties of racecraft that data alone can't teach. The balance of youth and experience, aggression and patience, was suddenly tilting in their favor. The first time the orange overalls zipped up around him again, it wasn't a nostalgic reunion, it was a statement. The fabric felt different, lighter somehow, not because of the material, but because of what it represented: autonomy, clarity, and a return to a space where his instincts could run unchecked. In the quiet moments before the cameras caught him, Hamilton allowed himself one thought: not about proving Ferrari wrong, not about silencing critics, but about validating the belief that still burned in him, that the hunger hadn't faded, that the reflexes were as sharp as ever, that the craft he'd honed over decades could still carve victories out of chaos. When the lights would eventually go out, there would be no hesitation. The launch would be violent, precise, and uncompromising. The world wouldn't just see a veteran making a final push. They would witness a racer unchained, reclaiming not just speed but the sheer joy of chasing victory on his own terms, in the colors that once sparked his legend, and now threatened to reignite it all over again.